Hello, and welcome to Storytime with Alaric. We are continuing to read Dan Simmons' Hyperion. Hopefully the quality will not suffer any today because I'm a little on the rushed side. So if there's any odd cuts or jumps, that's probably why. We once again have a trigger warning for this week. We are continuing with the very, very distinct and dramatic violent imagery and conflicting violent and sexual imagery. So that can be very distressing if you're not prepared for it. We are in the middle of the soldier's tale. Colonel Feedman Cassad arrived with the Force Fleet 1, 29 standard weeks later. 30 Omega-class torch ships, protecting a single Farcaster-equipped jump ship, penetrated the system at high speed. The Singularity Sphere was activated 3 hours after spin-down, and 10 hours after that there were 400 Force ships of the line in system. The counter-invasion began 21 hours later. Those were the mathematics of the first minutes of the Battle of Brescia. For Cassad, the memory of those days and weeks held not the mathematics, but the terrible beauty of combat. It was the first time jump ships had been used on anything above a division level, and there was the expected confusion. Cassad went through from 5 light minutes out and fell onto gravel and yellow dust, because the assault boat's Farcaster portal was facing down a steep incline made slick with mud and the blood of the first squad through. Cassad lay in the mud and looked down the hillside at madness. 10 of the 17 Farcaster assault boats were down and burning, scattered across the foothills and plantation fields like broken toys. The containment fields of the surviving boats were shrinking under an onslaught of missile and CPB fire that turned the landing areas into domes of orange flame. Cassad's tactical display was a hopeless mess. His visor showed a garble of impossible fire vectors, blinking red phosphors where Force troops lay dying, and overlays of Oster jamming ghosts. Someone was screaming, "Oh, God damn it, oh, God damn it," on his primary command circuit, and the implants registered a void where the command group's data should be. An enlisted man helped him up. Cassad flicked mud off his command wand and got out of the way of the next squad farcasting through, and the war was on. From his first minutes on South Brescia, Cassad realized that the new Bushido was dead. 8,000 superbly armed and trained Force ground troops advanced from their staging areas, seeking battle in an unpopulated place. Oster forces retreated behind a line of scorched earth, leaving only booby traps and dead civilians. Force used Farcasters to outmaneuver the enemy, to force him to fight. The Osters responded with a barrage of nuclear and plasma weapons, pinning the ground troops under force fields, while the Oster infantry retreated to prepare defenses around cities and dropship staging areas. There was no quick victories in space to shift the balance on South Brescia. Despite feints and the occasional fierce battles, the Osters retained complete control of everything within 3 AU of Brescia. Force space units fell back and concentrated on keeping the fleet within Farcaster range and protecting the primary jump ship. What had been forecast as a 2-day battle ground on for 30 days, then 60. Warfare had been thrown back to the 20th or 21st century. Long, grim campaigns fought through the brick dust of ruined cities over the corpses of civilians. The 80,000 original Force troops were ground up, reinforced with 100,000 more, and were still being decimated when the call went out for 200,000 more. Only the grim resolve of Menia Gladstone and a dozen others, determined senators, kept the war alive and the troops dying, while the billions of voices of the All Thing and the AI Advisory Council called for disengagement. Cassad had understood the change of tactics almost at once. His street-fighting instincts had risen to the forefront even before most of his division was wiped out in the Battle of the Stone Heap. While other Force commanders were all but ceasing to function, frozen into indecision by this violation of the new Bushido, Cassad, in command of his regiment and in temporary command of his division after the nuking of Command Group Delta, was trading men for time and calling for the release of fusion weapons to spearhead his own counterattack. By the time the Osters withdrew 97 days after the Force rescue of Brescia, Cassad had earned the double-edged nickname of the Butcher of South Brescia. It was rumored that even his own troops were afraid of him. And Cassad dreamed of her, with dreams that were more and less than dreams. On the last night of the battle for Stoneheap, in the maze of dark tunnels where Kassad and his hunter-killer groups used sonics and T5 gas to flush out the last warrens of Oster commanders, the colonel fell asleep amid the flame and screams, and felt the touch of her long fingers on his cheek and the soft compression of her breasts against him. When they entered New Vienna on the morning after the space strike Kassad had called in, the troops followed the glass-smooth, 20-meter-wide burn grooves into the lanced city. Kassad had stared without blinking at the rows of human heads lying on the pavement, carefully lined up as if to welcome the rescuing force troops with their accusatory stares. Kassad had returned to his command EMV, closed the hatches, and, curling up in the warm darkness smelling of rubber, heated plastics, charged ions, had heard her whispers over the babble of the C3 channels and implant coding. On the night before the Oster retreat, Kassad left the command conference on the HS Brazil, Farcast to his HQ in the indelible north of the Hine Valley, and took his command car to the summit to watch the final bombardment. The nearest of the tactical nuclear strikes was 45 kilometers away. The plasma bombs blossomed like orange and blood-red flowers planted in a perfect grid. Kassad counted more than 200 dancing columns of green light as the Hellwhip lances ripped the broad plateau to shreds. And even before he slept, while he sat on the flare skirt of the MV and shook pale after-images from his eyes, she came. She wore a pale blue dress and walked lightly between the dead burr-root plants on the hillside. The breeze lifted the hem of the soft fabric of her dress. Her face and arms were pale, almost translucent. She called his name. He could almost hear the words. And then the second wave of bombardment rolled in across the plain below him, and everything was lost in noise and flame. As tends to be the case in a universe apparently ruled by irony, Friedman Kassad passed unscathed through 97 days of the worst fighting the hegemony had ever seen, only to be wounded 2 days after the last of the Osters had retreated to their fleeing swarm ships. He was in the Civic Center building in Buckminster, one of the only 3 buildings left standing in the city, giving curt answers to stupid questions from World Web News Sweep, when a plasma booby trap, no larger than a micro switch, exploded 15 floors above, blew the news sweep and 2 of Kassad's aides through a ventilator grill onto the street beyond, and dropped the building on him. Kassad was medevaced to Division HQ, and then Farcast to the jump ship, now in orbit around Brescia's second moon. Then he was resuscitated and put on full life support while the military brass and hegemony politicians decided what to do with him. Because of the Farcaster connection and the real-time media coverage of Brescia, Colonel Friedman Kassad had been somewhat of a cause célèbre. The billions who had been appalled by the unprecedented savagery of South Brescia campaign would have been pleased to see Kassad court-martialed or tried for war crimes. CEO Gladstone and many others considered Kassad and the other force commanders as saviors. In the end, Kassad was put on a hospital spin ship for the slow trip back to the web. Since most of the physical repair would be done in Fugue anyway, it made some sense to let the old hospital ships work on the seriously wounded and the revivable dead. By the time Kassad and the other patients reached the World Web, they would be ready for active duty. More importantly, Kassad would have accrued a time debt of at least 18 standard months, and whatever controversy surrounding him might well be over by that time. Kassad awoke to see the dark shape of a woman bending over him. For a second, he was sure that it was she, and then he realized that it was a force medic. "Am I dead?" he whispered. "You were. You're on the HS Merrick. You've been through resuscitation and renewal several times, but you probably don't remember because of the Fugue hangover. We're ready to start the next step in physical therapy. Do you feel like trying to walk?" Kassad lifted his arm to cover his eyes. Even through the disorientation of fugue state, he now remembered the painful therapy sessions, the long hours in the RNA virus baths, and the surgery. Most of all, the surgery. "What's our route?" he asked, still shielding his eyes. "I forget how we're getting back to the web." The medic smiled, as if this were a question he asked each time he came out of fugue. Perhaps it was. "We'll be putting in at Hyperion and Garden," she said. "We're just entering the orbit of..." The woman was interrupted by the sound of the end of the world. Great bass trumpets blowing, metal-ripping furies screaming. Kassad rolled off the bed, wrapping the mattress around him as he fell in 1/6 G. Hurricane winds slid across the deck and hurled pitchers, trays, bedcloths, books, bodies, metal instruments, and countless other objects at him. Men and women were screaming, their voices rising through falsetto as the air rushed out of the ward. Kassad felt the mattress slam into the wall. He looked out between clenched fists. A meter from him, a football-sized spider with wildly waving legs was trying to force itself into a crack which had suddenly appeared in the bulkhead. The thing's jointless legs seemed to be swatting at the paper and other detritus whirling around it. The spider rotated, and Kassad realized it was the head of the medic. She had been decapitated in the initial explosion. Her long hair writhed at Kassad's face. Then the crack widened to the width of a fist, and the head disappeared through it. Kassad pulled himself up just as the boom arm quit spinning and up ceased to be. The only forces now in play were the hurricane winds still flinging everything in the ward toward the cracks and gaps in the bulkhead and the sickening lurch and tumble of the ship. Kassad swam against it, pulling himself toward the door to the boom arm corridor, using every handhold he could find, kicking free the last 5 meters. A metal tray struck him above the eye. A corpse with hemorrhaged eyes almost tumbled him back into the ward. The airtight emergency doors were slamming uselessly onto a dead Marine whose space-suited body blocked the seal from closing. Kassad rolled through onto the boom arm shaft and pulled the corpse after him. The door sealed behind him, but there was no more air in the shaft than there had been in the ward. Somewhere a klaxon scream thinned to inaudibility. Kassad also screamed, trying to relieve the pressure so that his lungs and eardrums would not burst. The boom arm was still draining air. He and the corpse were being sucked the 130 meters to the main body of the ship. He and the dead Marine tumbled along the boom arm shaft in a grisly waltz. It took Kassad 20 seconds to slap open the emergency releases on the Marine's suit, another minute to eject the man's corpse and to get his own body in. He was at least 10 centimeters taller than the dead man, and although the suit was built to allow some expansion, it still pinched painfully at his neck and wrists and knees. The helmet squeezed his forehead like a cushioned vice. Goblets of blood and moist white material clung to the insides of the visor. The piece of shrapnel which had killed the Marine had left entrance and exit holes, but the suit had done its best to seal itself. Most of the chest lights were red, and the suit did not respond when Kassad ordered it to give a status report, but the rebreather worked, although with a worrying rasp. Kassad tried the suit radio. Nothing, not even the background static. He found the comlog lead jacked into a hull Termex. Nothing. Ship pitched against them, metal reverberating into a succession of blows, and Kassad was thrown against the wall of the boom arm shaft. One of the transport cages tumbled by, its severed cables whipping like the tentacles of an agitated sea anemone. There were corpses in the cage, and more bodies tangled along the segments of spiral staircase, still intact along the shaft wall. Kassad kicked the remaining distance to the end of the shaft, and found all of the airtight doors there sealed, the boom arm shaft itself irised shut, but there were holes in the primary bulkhead large enough to drive a commercial EMV through. The ship lurched again and began to tumble more wildly, imparting complex new Coriolis forces to Kassad and everything else in the shaft. Kassad hung on torn metal and pulled himself through the rent in the triple hull of the HS Merrick. He almost laughed when he saw the interior. Whoever had lanced the old hospital ship had done it right, chopping and stabbing the hull with CPBs until pressure seals failed, self-seal units ruptured, damage control remotes overloaded, and the interior bulkheads collapsed. Then the enemy ship had put missiles into the guts of the Hulk, while warheads of what Force Space people quaintly called canister shot. The effect had been quite similar to setting off an antipersonnel grenade in a crowded rat maze. Lights shone through 1,000 holes, here and there becoming colorful rays where they found a colloidal base in a floating haze of dust or blood or lubricant. From where Kassad hung, twisting with the lurch and tumble of the ship, he could see a score or more of bodies, naked and torn, each moving with the deceptive underwater ballet grace of the zero-gravity dead. Most of the corpses floated within their own small solar system of blood and tissue. Several of them watched Kassad with the cartoon character stares of their pressure-expanded eyes and seemed to beckon him closer with random, languid movements of arms and hands. Kassad kicked through the wreckage to reach the main drop shaft in the command core. He had seen no weapons. It seemed that no one except the Marine had managed to suit up, but he knew that there would be a weapons locker in the command core or in the Marine quarters aft. Kassad stopped at the last torn pressure seal and stared. He did laugh this time. Beyond this point there was no main drop shaft. No aft section. There was no ship. This section, a boom arm and medical ward mod, a ragged chunk of the hull, had been ripped free of the ship as easily as Beowulf had torn the arm from Grendel's body. The final unsealed doorway to the drop shaft led to open space. Some kilometers away, Kazad could see a dozen other ravaged fragments of the HS Merrick tumbling in the glare of sunlight. A green and lapis planet loomed so close that Kazad felt a surge of acrophobia and clung more tightly to the doorframe. Even as he watched, a star moved above the limb of the planet. Laser weapons winked their ruby Morse, and a gutted ship section half a kilometer away across the gulf of vacuum from Kazad burst again in a gout of vaporized metal, freezing volatiles and tumbling black specks, which Kazad realized were bodies. Kazad pulled himself deeper into the concealing tangle of wreckage and considered his situation. The marine suit could not last more than another hour. Already Kazad could smell the rotten egg stench of the malfunctioning rebreather, and he had seen no airtight compartment or container during his struggle through the wreckage. And even if he found a closet or airlock to shelter in, what then? Kazad did not know if the planet below was Hyperion or Garden, but he was sure that there was no force presence on either world. He was also quite sure that no local defense forces would challenge an Oster warship. It would be days before any patrol craft investigated the wreckage. It was quite possible, Kazad knew, that the orbit of the tumbling piece of junk he now inhabited would decay before they sent anyone up to check on it, sending thousands of tons of twisted metal burning through the atmosphere. The locals would not like that, Kazad knew, but from their point of view, it might be preferable to let a bit of sky fall than to antagonize the Osters. If the planet had primitive orbital defenses or ground-based CPBs, he realized with a grim smile, it would make more sense for them to blast the wreckage than to fire on the Oster ship. It would make no difference to Kazad. Unless he did something quickly, he would be dead long before the remnants of the ship entered the atmosphere or the locals took action. The Marine's amplification shield had been cracked by the shrapnel which had killed him, but now Kazad tugged at what was left of the viewplate down over the visor. Telltales winked red, but there was still enough suit power to show the amplified view glowing pale green through the spiderweb of cracks. Kazad watched as the Oster torch ship stood off 100 clicks, its defense fields blurring background stars, and launched several objects. For an instant, Kazad was sure that these were the Coup de Grace missiles, and he found himself grinning joylessly at the certainty of having only a few seconds to live. Then he noticed their low velocity and notched the amplification higher. The power lights blinked red and the amplifier failed, but not before Kazad had seen the tapering ovoid shapes, spotted with thrusters and cockpit blasters, each trailing a tangle of 6 jointless manipular arms. Squids, the Force Space people had called the Oster boarding craft. Kazad pulled himself further back into the wreckage. He had only a few minutes before one or more of the squids reached his piece of the ship. How many Osters would be in one of those things? 10? 20? Kazad was sure that it would be no fewer than 10. They would be well armed and rigged with infrared and motion sensors. The elite Oster equivalent of hegemony space marines, the commandos would not only have been trained for free-for-all combat, but had been born and bred to zero-G. Their long limbs, prehensile toes, and prosthetic tails would be added advantages for this environment, although Kazad doubted that they needed any more advantages than they already had. He began to pull himself carefully back through the labyrinth of twisted metal, fighting the adrenaline fear surge that made him want to kick off screaming through the darkness. What did they want? Prisoners. That would solve his immediate survival problem. All he had to do to survive was surrender. The difficulty with that solution was that Kazad had seen the Force intelligence hollows of the Oster ships they had captured off Brescia. There had been more than 200 prisoners in the storage bay of that ship, and the Osters obviously had many questions for these hegemony citizens. Perhaps they had found it inconvenient to feed and imprison so many, or perhaps it was their basic interrogation policy. But the fact was that the Brescian civilians and captured Force troops had been found flayed open and pinned down onto steel trays like frogs in a biology lab, their organs bathed with nutrient fluids, arms and legs effectively amputated, eyes removed, and their minds readied for interrogators' questions with crude cortical comm taps and shunt plugs jacked directly through 3-centimeter holes in the skulls. Kazad pulled himself along, floating through debris and tangled entrails of the ship's wiring. He felt no inclination whatsoever to surrender. The tumbling hulk vibrated and then steadied as at least one of the squids attached itself to the hull or bulkhead. think, Kassad commanded. He needed a weapon more than a hiding place. Had he seen anything during his crawl through the wreckage that would help him survive? Kassad stopped moving and hung from an exposed section of fiber optic cables while he thought. The medical ward where he had awakened, beds, fugue tanks, intensive care apparatus, most of it expelled through the breaches in the spin model's hull. Boom arm shaft, elevator cage, corpses in the stairs, no weapons. Most of the bodies had been stripped by the canister shot explosions or sudden decompression. The elevator cables? No, too long, impossible to sever without tools. Tools? He had seen none. The medical officers flayed open along the corridors beyond the main drop shaft. Medical imaging rooms, MIR tanks, and CPE bays flung open like looted sarcophagi. At least one operating room intact, its interior a maze of scattered instruments and floating cables. The solarium, scraped clean when the windows exploded outward. Patients' lounges, medics' lounges, the scrub rooms, corridors, and unidentifiable cubicles. The corpses. Kassad hung there a second longer, oriented himself in the tumbling maze of light and shadow, and then kicked off. He had hoped for 10 minutes. He was given less than 8. He knew that the Oysters would be methodical and efficient, but had underestimated how efficient they could be in zero-G. He gambled his life that there would be at least 2 of them on each sweep, basic Space Marine procedure, much as Force Ground Jump Rats had learned to go door-to-door in city fighting, one to burst into each room, the other to provide cover fire. If there was more than 2, if the Oysters works in squads of 4, Kassad almost certainly would be dead. He was floating in the middle of Operating Room 3 when the Oyster came through the door. Kassad's rebreather had all but failed, and he was floating immobile, gasping foul air as the Oyster commander swung aside, and brought his 2 weapons to bear on the unarmed figure and a battered marine spacesuit. Kassad had bargained that the gruesome condition of his suit and visor would gain him a second or 2. Behind his gore-smeared faceplate, Kassad's eyes stared sightlessly upward as the Oyster's chest light swept across him. The commando carried 2 weapons, a sonic stunner in one hand and a smaller but much more lethal tight-beam pistol in the long toes of his left foot. He raised the sonic. Kassad had time to notice the killing spike on the prosthetic tail, and then he triggered the mouse in his gauntleted right hand. It had taken Kassad most of his 8 minutes to tie into the emergency generator of the operating room circuits. Not all of the surgery lasers had survived, but 6 still worked. Kassad had positioned 4 of the smaller ones to cover the area just to the left of the doorway, the 2 bone cutters to target the space to his right. The Oyster had moved to the right. The Oyster's suit exploded. The lasers continued to slice away in their programmed circles as Kassad propelled himself forward, ducking under the blue beams now swirling in a spreading mist of useless suit sealant and boiling blood. He wrestled the sonic away just as the second Oyster swung into the room, agile as any old Earth chimp. Kassad pressed the sonic against the man's helmet and fired. The suited figure went limp. The prosthetic tail spasmed a few times from random nerve impulses. Triggering the sonic that close was no way to take a prisoner. A burst from that distance turned a human brain into something resembling oatmeal mush. Kassad did not want to take a prisoner. He kicked free, grabbed a girder, swept the active sonic across the open doorway. No one else came through. A check 20 seconds later showed an empty corridor. Kassad ignored the first body and stripped the man with the intact suit. The commando was naked under the spacesuit, and it turned out not to be a man. The female commando had short-cropped blonde hair, small breasts, and a tattoo just above her line of pubic hair. She was very pale, and droplets of blood floated out from her nose, ears, and eyes. Kassad made a note that the Oysters used women in their Marines. All of the Oyster bodies in Brescia had been male. He kept his helmet and rebreather pack on as he kicked the body aside and tugged on the unfamiliar suit. Vacuum exploded blood vessels in his flesh. Deep cold nipped at him as he struggled with the strange clasps and locks. Tall as he was too short for the woman's suit. He could operate the hand gauntlets by stretching, but the foot gloves and tail connections were hopeless. He let them hang useless as he bailed out of his own helmet and wrestled the Oyster bubble into place. Lights in the collar disc key glowed amber and violet. Kassad heard the rush of air through aching eardrums and almost gagged as the thick, rich scents assaulted him. He assumed it was the sweet smell of home to an Oyster. Earphones patches in the bubble whispered coded commands in a language which sounded like an audio tape of ancient English played backward at high speed. Kassad was gambling again, this time on the fact that the Oster ground units on Brescia had functioned as semi-independent teams, united by voice radio and basic telemetry, rather than a force ground type of tactical implant web. If they used the same system here, then the commando leader might know that two of his, or her, troops were missing, probably even have medcom readings on them, but he might not know exactly where they were. Kassad decided that it was time to quit hypothesizing and to get moving. He programmed the mouse to have the surgical lasers fire on anything entering the operating room, and the mouse stumbled his way down the corridor. Moving in one of these damn suits, he thought, was like trying to walk in a gravity field while standing on your own trousers. He had brought along both energy pistols, and, finding no belt, lock rings, hooks, Velcro pads, mag clamps, or pockets to secure them with, now floated along like some drunken holodrama pirate, a weapon in each hand, bouncing from wall to wall. Reluctantly, he left one pistol floating behind him while he tried to hook himself along one-handed. The gauntlet fit like a size 15 mitten on a size 2 hand. The damn tail wobbled, banged against his helmet bubble, and was a literal pain in the ass. Twice he squeezed into a crevice when he saw lights in the distance. He was just about to the deck opening where he had watched the squid approach, when he rounded a corner and almost floated into 3 Oster commandos. The fact that he was wearing an Oster suit gave him at least a 2-second advantage. He shot the first suited figure in the helmet at point-blank range. The second man or woman fired a wild sonic burst past Kassad's left shoulder a second before he pulled 3 bolts into the Oster's chest plate. The third commando flipped backward, found 3 handholds, and was out of sight around a broken bulkhead before Kassad could retarget. His headset rang with curses, commands, and questions. Kassad gave silent chase. The third Oster would have escaped if he had not rediscovered honor and turned to fight. Kassad felt an inexplicable sense of déjà vu as he put an energy bolt through the man's left eye from 5 meters away. The corpse tumbled backward into sunlight. Kassad pulled himself to the opening and stared at the squid, moored not 20 meters away. It was, he thought, the first undiluted piece of luck he had had in some time. He kicked across the gap, knowing that if someone wanted to shoot him from the squid or the wreckage, there was nothing he could do about it. He felt the scrotum-lifting tension he always experienced when he was an obvious target. No shots were fired. Commands and interrogatives squawked in his ears. He could not understand them, did not know where they originated, and, on the whole, thought it best if he stayed out of the dialogue. The clumsiness of the suit almost caused him to miss the squid. He thought briefly that such an anticlimax would be the universe's fitting verdict on his martial pretenses. The brave warrior floating off into near-planet orbit. No maneuvering systems, no propellant, no reaction mass of any sort. Even the pistol was non-recoil. He would end his life as useless and harmless as a child's runaway balloon. Kassad stretched until his joints popped, caught a whip antenna, and pulled himself hand over hand to the squid's hull. Where the hell was the airlock? The hull was relatively smooth for a spacefaring vessel, but was decorated with a riot of designs, decals, and panels, announcing what he assumed were the Oster equivalents of no step and danger thruster port. No entrances were visible. He guessed that there were Osters on board, a pilot at least, and that they were probably wondering why their returning commando was crawling around the hull like a sapvine crab rather than cycling the airlock. Or perhaps they knew why, and were waiting inside with drawn pistols. At any rate, it was obvious that no one was going to open the door for him. The hell with it, thought Kassad, and shot out one of the observation blisters. The Osters kept a tidy ship. Not much more than the equivalent of a few lost paper clips and coins geysered out with the ship's air. Kassad waited until the eruption had died down and squeezed through the gap. He was in the carrier section, a cushioned hold looking a lot like a jump rat bay of any dropship or APC. Kassad made a mental note that a squid probably held about 20 Oster commandos in full vacuum combat gear. Now it was empty. An open hatch led to the cockpit. Only the command pilot had remained on board, and he was in the final process of unbelting when Kassad shot him. Kassad pushed the body into the carrier section and strapped himself into what he hoped was the command chair. Warm sunlight came through the blister above him. Video monitors and console holos showed scenes from dead ahead, astern, and shoulder camera glimpses of the search operation inside. Kassad caught a glimpse of the nude body in Operating Room 3 and several figures in a firefight with surgical lasers. In the holodramas of Friedman Kassad's childhoods, heroes always seemed to know how to operate skimmers, spacecraft, exotic EMVs, and other strange machinery whenever the need arose. Kassad had been trained to handle military transports, simple tanks and APCs, even an assault boat or dropship if he was desperate. If stranded on a runway for spacecraft, a remote possibility, he could find his way around the command core sufficiently to communicate with the primary computer or put out a distress call on a radio or fat line transmitter. Sitting in the command chair of an oyster squid, Kassad did not have a clue. That was not quite true. He immediately recognized the remote grip slots for the squid's tentacle manipulators, and given 2 or 3 hours of thought and inspection, he might have figured out several other controls. He did not have the time. The forward screen showed 3 spacesuited figures jumping for the squid, firing as they came. The pale, oddly alien head of an oyster commander suddenly materialized on the holo console. Kassad heard shouts from his bubble ear patches. Globules of sweat hung in front of his eyes and streaked the insides of his helmet. He shook them away as best he could, squinted at the control consoles, and pushed several likely-looking surfaces. If there were voice command circuits, override controls, or a suspicious ship's computer, Kassad knew, he was screwed. He had thought of all of this in a second or two before he shot the pilot, but had not been able to think of a way to coerce or trust the man. No, this had to be the way, though Kassad, even as he tapped more control surfaces. A thruster began firing. The squid pulled and tugged at its moorings. Kassad bounced back and forth in his webbing. "Shit," he whispered, his first audible comment since he had asked the force medic where the ship was putting in. He strained far enough forward to get his gauntleted fingers into the grip slots. 4 of the 6 manipulators released. 1 ripped off. The final one tore away a chunk of bulkhead from the HS Merrick. The squid tumbled free. Video cameras showed 2 of the spacesuited figures missing their jumps, the third clutching at the same whip antenna which had saved Kassad. Knowing roughly where the thruster controls were now, Kassad tapped in a frenzy. An overhead light came on. All of the holoprojectors went dead. The squid commenced a maneuver which incorporated all of the most violent elements of pitch, roll, and yaw. Kassad saw the spacesuited form tumble past the overhead blister, appear briefly on the forward video screen, become a speck on the aft screen. The oyster was still firing energy bolts as he, or she, became too small to see. Kassad struggled to stay conscious as the violent tumbling continued. Various voices and visual alarms were screaming for his attention. Kassad tapped at thruster controls, considered it a success, and pulled his hands away when he felt as if he was being pulled apart in only 2 directions rather than 5. A random camera shot showed him that the torch ship was receding. Good. Kassad had no doubt that the oyster warship could destroy him at any second, and that it would if he approached or threatened it in any way. He did not know if the squid was armed, personally doubted if it would carry anything larger than anti-personnel weapons, but he knew beyond a doubt that no torch ship commander would allow an out-of-control shuttlecraft to come anywhere near his ship. Kassad assumed the oysters all knew by now that the squid had been hijacked by the enemy. He would not be surprised, disappointed but not surprised, if the torch ship vaporized him at any second, but in the meantime he was counting on 2 emotions that were quintessentially human, if not necessarily oyster human: curiosity and the desire for revenge. Curiosity, he knew, could easily be overridden in times of stress, but he counted on paramilitary, semi-feudal culture like the oysters to be deeply involved with revenge. Everything else being equal, with no chance to hunt them further and almost no chance to escape, it would seem that Colonel Feedman Kassad had become a prime candidate for one of their dissection trays. He hoped so. Kassad looked at the forward video display, frowned, and loosened his harness long enough to look out the overhead blister. The ship was tumbling, but not nearly so violently as before. The planet seemed closer. One hemisphere filled the view above him, but he had no idea how close the squids was to atmosphere. He could read none of the data displays. He could only guess what their orbital velocity had been and how violent a re-entry shock would be. His one long glimpse from the wreckage of the Merrick had suggested that Kassad that they were very close, perhaps only 500 or 600 clicks above the surface, and in the kind of parking orbit which he knew preceded the launching of dropships. Kassad tried to wipe his face and frowned when the tips of loose gauntleted fingers tapped at his visor. He was tired. Hell, only a few hours earlier he had been in fugue, and just a few ship weeks before that he had almost certainly been body dead. He wondered if the world below was Hyperion or Garden. He had been to neither, but knew that Garden was more widely settled, closer to becoming a hegemony colony. He hoped it was Garden. The torch ship launched 3 assault boats. Kassad saw them clearly before the aft camera panned beyond range. He tapped at the thruster controls until it felt as though the ship was tumbling more quickly toward the wall of planet above. There was little else he could do. The squid reached atmosphere before the 3 Oster assault boats reached the squid. The boats undoubtedly were armed and well within range, but someone on the command circuit must have been curious. Or furious. Kassad's squid was in no way aerodynamic. As with most ship-to-ship craft, the squid could flirt with planetary atmospheres, but was doomed if it dove too deeply into the gravity well. Kassad saw the telltale red glow of re-entry, heard the ion buildup on the active radio channels, and suddenly wondered if this had been such a good idea. Atmospheric drag stabilized the squid, and Kassad felt the first tentative tug of gravity as he searched the console and the command chair arms for the control circuit he prayed would be there. A static-filled video screen showed one of the dropships growing a blue plasma tail as it decelerated. The illusion created was similar to that encountered when one skydiver watched another open his chute or activate his suspension rig. The assault boat seemed to climb suddenly. Kassad had other things to worry about. There seemed to be no obvious bailout control, no ejection apparatus. Every force space shuttle carried some sort of atmospheric egress device. It was a custom dating back almost 8 centuries to when the entire realm of spaceflight consisted only of tentative excursions just above the skin of old Earth's atmosphere. A ship-to-ship shuttle probably would never need a planetary bailout device, but age-old fears written into ancient regulations tended to die hard. Or so the theory went. Kassad could find nothing. The ship was quaking now, spinning, and beginning to heat up in earnest. Kassad slapped open his harness release and pulled himself toward the rear of the squid, not even sure what he was looking for. Suspension packs? Parachutes? A set of wings? There was nothing in the troop carrier section except the corpse of the Oster pilot, and a few storage compartments not much larger than lunch boxes. Kassad tore through them, finding nothing bigger than a medkit. No miracle devices. Kassad could hear the squid shaking and beginning to break up as he hung on a pivot ring, and all but accepted the fact that the Osters had not wasted money or space on such low-probability rescue devices for their squids. Why should they? Their lifetimes were spent in the darkness between star systems. Their concepts of an atmosphere was the 8-click pressurized tube of a can city. The external audio sensors on Kassad's bubble helmet began to pick up the raging hiss of air on the hull, as through the broken blister in the aft section. Kassad shrugged. He had gambled too many times and lost. The squid shuddered and bounced. Kassad could hear the manipulator tentacles tearing away from the bow. The Oster's corpse suddenly was sucked up and out of the broken blister like an ant into a vacuum cleaner. Kassad clung to the pivot ring and stared through the open hatch at the control seats in the cockpit. It struck him that they were wonderfully archaic, like something out of the textbook of the earliest spacecraft. Parts of the ship's exterior were burning away now, roaring past the observation blisters like gobbles of lava. Kassad closed his eyes and tried to remember lectures from Olympus Command School on the structure and layout of ancient space-going craft. The squid began a terminal tumble. The noise was incredible. "By Allah!" gasped Kassad, a cry he had not uttered since childhood. He began pulling himself forward into the cockpit, bracing himself on the open hatch, finding handholds on the deck as if he were climbing a vertical wall. He was climbing a wall. The squid had spun, stabilizing in a stern-first death dive. Kassad climbed under a 3G load, knowing that a single slip would break every bone in his body. Behind him, atmospheric hiss turned into a scream, and then into a dragon roar. The troop carrier section was burning through in fierce, molten explosions. Climbing into the command seat was like negotiating a rock overhang with the weight of 2 other climbers swinging from his back. The clumsy gauntlets made his grip on the headrest even less sure as Kassad hung over the vertical drop to the flaming cauldron of the carrier section. The ship lurched. Kassad swung his legs up, and he was in the command seat. The display videos were dead. Flame heated the overhead blister to a sick red. Kassad almost lost consciousness as he bent forward, his fingers feeling in the darkness below the command seat, between his knees. There was nothing. Wait. A hand grip. No, sweet Christ and Allah. A D-ring. Something out of the history books. The squid began to break up. Overhead, the blister burned through and spattered liquid perspex out the interior of the cockpit, splashing Kassad's suit and visor. He smelled plastic melting. The squid was spinning as it broke up. Kassad's suit turned pink. Sight turned pink. Dimmed, was gone. He used numb fingers to tighten the harness tighter. Either it was cutting into his chest or the perspex was burned through. His hand went back to the D-ring, fingers too clumsy to close around it. No. Pull! Too late, the squid flew apart in a final screech, an explosion of flame, the control console tearing through the cockpit in 10,000 shrapnel-sized bits. Kassad was slammed into his seat, up, out, into the heart of the flame, tumbling. Kassad was dimly aware that the seat was projecting its own containment field as it tumbled. Flame was centimeters from his face. Pyrobolts fired, kicking the ejection seat out of the squid's blazing slipstream. The command seat made its own track of blue flame across the sky. Microprocessors spun the seat so that the disk of the force field was between Kassad and the furnace of friction. A giant sat on Kassad's chest as he decelerated across 2,000 kilometers of sky at 8 gravities. Kassad forced his eyelids open once more, noted that he lay curled in the belly of a long column of blue-white flame, and then he closed his eyes again. He saw no sign of a controller for a parachute, suspension pack, or any other braking device. It didn't matter. He could not move his arms or hands in any case. The giant shifted, grew heavier. Kassad realized that part of his helmet bubble had melted or been blown away. The noise was indescribable. It didn't matter. He closed his eyes more tightly. It was a good time to take a nap. Kassad opened his eyes and saw the dark shape of a woman bending over him. For a second, he thought it was her. He looked again and realized that it was her. She touched his cheek with cool fingers. "Am I dead?" whispered Kassad, raising his own hand to grip her wrist. "No." Her voice was soft and throaty, burred with the hint of an accent he could not place. He had never heard her speak before. "You're real?" "Yes." Kassad sighed and looked around. He lay naked under a thin robe on some sort of couch or platform set in the middle of a dark, cavernous room. Overhead, starlight was visible through a broken roof. Kassad raised his other hand to touch her shoulder. Her hair was a dark nimbus above him. She wore a loose, thin gown, which, even in the starlight, allowed him to see the outlines of her body. He caught her scent, the fragrant hint of soap and skin and her that he knew so well from their other times together. "You must have questions," she whispered as Kassad released the gold clasp which held her gown in place. The gown whispered to the floor. She wore nothing underneath. Above them, the band of the Milky Way was clearly visible. "No," said Kassad, and pulled her to him. Toward morning, a breeze arose, but Kassad pulled a light cover over them. The thin material seemed to preserve all of their body heat, and they lay together in perfect warmth. Somewhere, sand or snow rasped at bare walls. The stars were very clear and very bright. They awoke at the first hint of dawn, their faces close together under the silken coverlet. She ran her hand down Kassad's side, finding old and recent scars. "Your name," whispered Kassad. "Hush," she whispered back, her hand sliding lower. Kassad moved his face into the scented curve of her neck. Her breasts were soft against him. Night paled to morning. Somewhere sand or snow blew against bare walls. They made love, slept, made love again. In full light they rose and dressed. She had laid out underwear, grey tunic, and trousers for Kassad. They fit perfectly, as did the sponge socks and soft boots. The woman wore a similar outfit of navy blue. "Your name?" Kassad asked, as they left the building with the shattered dome and walked through a dead city. "Moneta," said his dream, "or Mimosine, whichever name pleases you more." "Moneta," whispered Kassad. He looked up at the small sun, rising into a lapis sky. "This is Hyperion?" "Yes." "How did I land? Suspensor field? Parachute?" "You descended under a wing of golden foil. I don't hurt. There were no wounds. They were tended to." "What is this place?" "The city of poets. Abandoned more than 100 years ago. Beyond that hill lie the time tombs." "The Oster salt boats that were following me? One landed nearby. The Pain Lord took the crew unto himself. The other two sat down some distance away." "Who is the Pain Lord?" "Come," said Moneta. The dead city ended in desert. Fine sand slid across white marble, half buried in dunes. To the west, an Oster dropship sat with its portals irised open. Nearby on a fallen column, a thermal cube yielded hot coffee and fresh-baked rolls. They ate and drank in silence. Kassad worked to recall the legend of Hyperion. "The Pain Lord is the Shrike?" he said at last. "Of course. You're from here, from the City of Poets?" Moneta smiled and slowly shook her head. Cassad finished his coffee and set the cup down. The feeling that he was in a dream persisted, much stronger than during any sim he had ever participated in. But the coffee had tasted pleasantly bitter. The sun was warm on his face and hands. "Come, Cassad," said Moneta. They crossed expanses of cold sand. Cassad found himself glancing skyward, knowing that the Oster torch ships could lance them from orbit, then knowing with a sudden certainty that it would not. The time tombs lay in a valley, a low obelisk glowing softly. A stone sphinx seemed to absorb the light. A complex structure of twisted pylons threw shadows onto itself. Other tombs were silhouettes against the rising sun. Each of the tombs had a door, and each door was open. Cassad knew that they had been open when the first explorers discovered the tombs, and that the structures were empty. More than 3 centuries of searching for hidden rooms, tombs, vaults, and passageways had been fruitless. "This is as far as you can go," Moneta said as they neared the cliff at the head of the valley. "The time tides are strong today." Cassad's tactical implant was silent. He had no comlog. He searched his memory. "There are anti-entropic force fields around the time tombs," he said. "Yes." "The tombs are ancient. The anti-entropic fields keep them from aging." "No," said Moneta. "The time tides drive the tombs backward through time." "Backward through time," Cassad repeated stupidly. "Look." Shimmering, mirage-like, a tree of steel thorns appeared out of the haze, and a sudden dust storm of ochre sand. The thing seemed to fill the valley, rising at least 200 meters into the height of the cliffs. Branches shifted, dissolved, and reformed like elements of a poorly tuned hologram. Sunlight danced on 5-meter-long thorns. Corpses of Oster men and women, all naked, were impaled on at least a score of these thorns. Other branches held other bodies. Not all were human. The dust storm obscured the view for a moment when the wind subsided and the vision was gone. "Come," said Moneta. Cassad followed her through the fringes of the time tides, avoiding the ebb and flow of the anti-entropic field the way children would play tag with an ocean surf on a broad beach. Cassad felt the pull of the time tides like waves of déjà vu, tugging at every cell of his body. Just beyond the entrance to the valley, where hills opened to the dunes and low moors led to the City of Poets, Moneta touched a wall of blue slate, and an entrance opened to a long, low room set into the cliff face. "Is this where you live?" asked Cassad, but saw immediately that there were no signs of habitation. The stone walls of the room were inset with shelves and crowded niches. "We must ready ourselves," whispered Moneta, and the lightning shifted to a golden hue. A long rack lowered its wares, a wafer-thin strip of reflective polymer curtained from the ceiling to serve as a mirror. Cassad watched with the calm passivity of a dreamer as Moneta stripped off her clothes and then his. Their nudity was no longer erotic, merely ceremonial. "You have been in my dreams for years," he told her. "Yes, your past, my future. The shock wave of events moves across time like ripples on a pond." Cassad blinked as she raised a gold ferrule and touched his chest. He felt a slight shock, and his flesh became a mirror, his head and face as a featureless ovoid reflecting all the color tones and textures of the room. A second later, Moneta joined him, her body becoming a cascade of reflections, water over quicksilver over chrome. Cassad saw his own reflecting reflection on every curve and muscle of her body. Moneta's breasts caught and bent the light. Her nipples rose like small splashes on a mirrored pond. Cassad moved to embrace her and felt their surfaces flow together like magnetized fluid. Under the connecting fields, his flesh touched hers. "Your enemies await beyond the city," she whispered. The chrome of her face flowed with light. "Enemies? The Osters, the ones who followed you here." Cassad shook his head, saw the reflection do likewise. "They're not important anymore." "Oh, yes," whispered Moneta. "The enemy is always important. You must arm yourself." "With what?" But even as he spoke, Cassad realized that she was touching him with a bronze sphere, a dull blue torrid. His altered body spoke to him now as clearly as troops reporting in on an implant command circuit. Kassad felt the bloodlust build in him with turgid strength. "Come," said Moneta, leading the way out into the open desert again. The sunlight seemed polarized and heavy. Kassad felt as if they were gliding across the dunes, flowing like liquid through the white marble streets of the dead city. Near the west end of town, near the shattered remnants of a structure still bearing the inscribed lintel of Poets' Amphitheater, something stood, waiting. For a second, Kassad thought it was another person wearing the chromium force fields he and Moneta were draped in, but only for a second. There was nothing human about this particular quicksilver over chrome construct. Kassad dreamily noted the forearms, retractable finger blades, the profusion of thorn spikes on throat, forehead, wrists, knees, and body, but not once did his gaze leave the 2,000-faceted eyes, which burned with a red flame that paled sunlight and dimmed the day to blood shadows. "The Shrike," thought Kassad. "The Lord of Pain," whispered Moneta. The thing turned and led them out of the dead city. Kassad approved of the way the Osters had prepared their defenses. The two assault boats were grounded less than a half a kilometer apart. Their guns, projectors, and missile turrets covered each other, and a full 360 degrees of fire. Oster ground troops had been busy digging revediments 100 meters out from the boats, and Kassad could see at least 2 EM tanks hull down, their projection arrays and launch tubes commanding the wide, empty moor between the Poet City and the boats. Kassad's vision had been altered. He could see the overlapping ship containment fields as ribbons of yellow haze, the motion sensors and anti-personnel mines as eggs of pulsing red light. He blinked, realizing that something was wrong with the image. Then it came to him. Besides the thickness of the light and his enhanced perception of energy fields, nothing was moving. The Oster troops, even those set in attitudes of motion, were as stiff as the toy soldiers he had played with as a boy in the Tharsis slums. The M tanks were dug into their hold-down positions, but Kassad noticed that now even their acquisition radars, visible to him as the concentric purple arcs, were motionless. He glanced skyward and saw some sort of large bird hanging in the sky, as unmoving as an insect frozen in amber. He passed a cloud of wind-blown dust, hanging suspended, extended one chrome hand, and flicked spirals of particles to the ground. Ahead of them, the Shrike strode casually through the red mist of sensor mines, stepped over the blue lines of trip beams, ducked under the violet pulses of the autofire scanners, passed through the yellow containment field and the green wall of the sonic defense perimeter, and walked into the assault boat's shadow. Moneta and Kassad followed. How is this possible? Kassad realized that he had posed the question through a medium that was something less than telepathy, but something far more sophisticated than implant conduction. He controls time. The Pain Lord. Of course. Why are we here? Moneta gestured toward the motionless Osters. They are your enemies. Kassad felt that he was finally awakening from a long dream. This was real. The Oster's trooper's eyes, unblinking behind his helmet, were real. The Oster assault boat, rising like a bronze tombstone to his left, was real. Feedman Kassad realized that he could kill them all. Commandos, assault boat crew, all of them. And they could do nothing about it. He knew that time had not stopped, any more than it stopped while a ship was under hawking drive. It was merely a matter of varying rates. The bird, frozen above them, would complete the flap of its wings, given enough minutes or hours. The Oster in front of him would close his eyes in a blink if Kassad had the patience to watch long enough. Meanwhile, Kassad and Moneta and the Shrike could kill all of them without the Osters realizing that they were under attack. It was not fair, Kassad realized. It was wrong. It was the ultimate violation of the new Bushido, worse in its way than the wanton murder of civilians. The essence of honor lay in the moment of combat between equals. He was about to communicate this to Moneta when she said thought, "Watch." Time began again, with an explosion of sound not unlike the rush of the air into an airlock. The bird soared and circled overhead. A desert breeze blew dust against the static-charged containment field. An Oster commando rose from one knee, saw the Shrike and the 2 human shapes, screamed something over his tactical comm channel, and raised his energy weapon. The Shrike did not seem to move. To Kassad, it merely ceased being here and appeared there. The Oster commando emitted a second, shorter scream, and then looked down in disbelief as the Shrike's arm withdrew and the man's heart in its bladed fist. The Oster stared, opened his mouth as if to speak, and collapsed. Kassad turned to his right and found himself face to face with an armored Oster. The commando ponderously lifted a weapon. Kassad swung his arm, felt the chrome force field hum, and saw the flat of his hand cut through body armor, helmet, and neck. The Oster's head rolled in the dust. Kassad leaped into a low trench and saw several troopers begin to turn. Time was still out of joint. The enemy moved in extreme slow motion. 1 second, jerked like a damaged hollow to 4/5 speed in the next instant. They were never as quick as Kassad. Gone were his thoughts of the new Bushido. These were the barbarians who had tried to kill him. He broke one man's back, stepped aside, jabbed rigid chrome fingers through the body armor of a second man, crushed the larynx of the third, dodged a knife blade moving in slow motion, and kicked the spine out of the knife wielder. He leapt up, out of the ditch. Kassad! Kassad ducked as the laser beam crept past his shoulder, burning its way through the air like a slow fuse of ruby light. Kassad smelled ozone as it crackled past. Impossible! I've dodged a laser! He picked up a stone and flung it at the Oster manning the tank-mounted hell whip. A sonic boom cracked. The gunner exploded backward. Kassad pulled a plasma grenade from the corpse's bandolier, leaped to the tank hatch, was 30 meters away before the explosion geysered flame as high as the assault boat's bow. Kassad paused in the eye of the storm to see Moneta in the center of her own circle of carnage. Blood splashed her but did not adhere, flowing like oil on water across both the rainbow curves of chin, shoulder, breast, and belly. She looked at him across the battlefield, and Kassad felt a renewed surge of bloodlust in himself. Behind her, the Shrike moved slowly through the chaos, choosing victims as if he were harvesting. Kassad watched the creature wink in and out of existence, and realized that, to the Pain Lord, he and Moneta would appear to be moving as slowly as the Osters did to Kassad. Time jumped, moved to 4/5 speed. The surviving troops were panicked now, firing into one another, deserting their posts, and fighting to get aboard the assault boat. Kassad tried to realize what the past minute or two had been like for them. Blurs moving through their defensive positions, comrades dying in great gouts of blood. Kassad watched Moneta moving through their ranks, killing at her leisure. To his amazement, he discovered that he had some control of time. Blink, and his opponent slowed to 1/3 speed. Blink, and events moved at nearly their normal pace. Kassad's sense of honor and sanity called out for him to stop the slaughter, but his almost sexual bloodlust overpowered any objections. Someone in the assault boat had sealed the airlock, and now a terrified commando used a shaped plasma charge to blow the portal open. The mob pressed in, trampling the wounded in their flight from the unseen killers. Kassad followed them in. The phrase, "fight like a cornered rat," is an extremely apt description. Throughout the history of military encounters, human combatants have been known to fight at their fiercest when challenged in enclosed places where flight is not an option. Whether in the passageways of Lehane Saint and Hougoumont at Waterloo, or in the hive tunnels of Lucius, some of the most terrible hand-to-hand battles in history have been fought in cramped spaces where no retreat is possible. It was true this day. The Osters fought and died like cornered rats. The Shrike had disabled the assault boat. Moneta remained outside to kill the 30 commandos who had stayed at their posts. Kassad kills those within. In the end, the final assault boat fired on its doomed counterpart. Kassad was outside by then, and he watched the particle beams and high-intensity lasers creep toward him, followed an eternity later by the missiles, which seemed to move so slowly that he could have written his name on them in flight. By that time, all of the Osters were dead in and around the overrun boat, but its containment field held. Energy dispersion and impact explosions tossed corpses around on the outer perimeter, set fire to equipment, and glazed the sand to glass. But Kassad and Moneta watched from inside a dome of orange flame as the remaining assault boat retreated to space. "Can we stop them?" Kassad was panting, pouring sweat, and literally quivering from excitement. "We could," replied Moneta, "but we do not want to. They will carry the message to the swarm." "What message?" "Come here, Kassad." He turned at the sound of her voice. The reflective force field was gone. Monetta's flesh was oiled with sweat. Her dark hair was matted against her temples. Her nipples were hard. "Come here." Cassad glanced down at himself. His own force field was gone. He had willed it away, and he was more sexually excited than he could ever remember being. "Come here," Monetta whispered this time. Cassad went to her, lifted her, felt the sweat-slick smoothness of her buttocks as he carried her to an empty stretch of grass atop a wide, curved hummock. He lowered her to the ground between piles of oyster bodies, roughly opened her legs, took both her hands in the grasp of one of his, lifted her arms above her head, pinned them to the ground, and lowered his long body between her legs. "Yes," whispered Monetta, as he kissed the lobe of her left ear, set his lips to the pulse at the hollow of her neck, licked the salt tang of sweat from her breasts. Lying among the dead, more dead to come, the thousands, the millions, laughter out of dead bellies, the long lines of troops emerging from jump ships to enter the waiting flames. Yes, her breath was hot in his ear. She freed her hands, slid them along Cassad's damp shoulders, trailed long nails down his back, grasped his buttocks to pull him closer. Cassad's erection scraped her pubic hair, throbbed against the cusp of her belly. Farcaster portals opened to admit the cold lengths of attack carriers, the warmth of plasma explosions, hundreds of ships, thousands dancing and dying like dust motes in the whirlwind. Great columns of solid ruby light lancing across great distances, bathing targets in the ultimate surge of warmth, bodies boiling in red light. "Yes," moaned Monetta, opening her mouth and body to him, warmth above and below, her tongue in his mouth as he entered her, welcomed by warm friction. His body strained deep, pulled back slightly, allowed the moist warmth to engulf him further as they began to move together. Heat on 100 worlds, continents burning in bright spasms, the roil of boiling seas, the air itself aflame, oceans of superheated air swelled like warm skin, rising to a lover's touch. Yes, yes, yes. Monetta's breaths warmed against his lips. Her skin is oil and velvet. Cassad thrusts quickly now, the universe contracting as sensation expands, senses dwindling as she closes warm and wet and tight around him. Her hips thrust harshly in response now, as if sensing the terrible build and pressure at the base of his being, demanding. Cassad grimaces, closed his eyes, sees fireballs expanding, stars dying, suns exploding in great pulses of flame, star systems perishing in ecstasy of destruction. He feels pain in his chest, his hips not stopping, moving faster even as he opens his eyes and sees the great thorn of steel rising from between Monetta's breasts, almost impaling him as he unconsciously pulls up and back, the thorn blade drawing blood which drips on her flesh, her pale flesh, reflective now, flesh as cold as dead metal, his hips still moving even as he watches through passion-dimmed eyes as Monetta's lips wither and curl back, revealing rows of steel blades where teeth had been, metal blades slashing at his buttocks where fingers had gripped, legs like powerful steel bands imprisoning his pumping hips, her eyes. In the last seconds before orgasm, Cassad tries to pull away, his hands on her throat pressing. She clings like a leech, a lamprey ready to drain him. They roll against the dead bodies, her eyes like red jewels blazing with a mad heat, like that which fills his aching testicles, expanding like a flame, spilling over. Cassad slams both hands against the soil, lifts himself away from her, from it, his strength insane but not enough as terrible gravities press them together, sucking like a lamprey's mouth as he threatens to explode, looks in her eyes. The death of worlds, the death of worlds! Cassad screams and pulls away. Strips of his flesh rip away as he lunges up and sideways. Metal teeth click shut in his steel vagina, missing his glands by a moist millimeter. Cassad slumps on his side, rolls away, hips moving, unable to stop his ejaculation. Semen explodes in streams, falls on the curled fist of a corpse. Cassad moans, rolls again, curls in a fetal position, even as he comes again and again. He hears the hiss and rustle as she rises beside him. Cassad rolls on his back and squints up against the sunlight and his own pain. She stands above him, legs apart, a silhouette of thorns. Cassad wipes sweat from his eyes, sees his wrist come away with blood, and waits for the killing blow. His skin contracts in anticipation of the slash of blade into flesh. Panting, Cassad looks up to see Minetta above him, thighs flesh rather than steel, her groin matted from the moisture of their passion. Her face is dark, the sun behind her, but he sees red flames dying in the multifaceted pits of her eyes. She smiles, and he sees sunlight glint on rows of metal teeth. Cassad, she whispers, and it is the sound of sand scraping against bone. Cassad tears his gaze away, struggles to his feet, and stumbles across corpses and burning rubble in his terror to be free. He does not look back. Scouting elements of Hyperion's self-defense force found Colonel Friedman Cassad almost 2 days later. He was discovered lying unconscious on one of the grassy moors which led to the abandoned Kronos Keep, some 20 kilometers from the dead city and the wreckage of the Oster ejection pod. Cassad was naked and almost dead from the effects of exposure and several serious wounds, but he responded well to the emergency field treatment and was immediately airlifted south of the Brindle Ridge to a hospital in Keats. Reconnaissance squads from the SDF battalion moved northward carefully, cautious of the anti-entropic tides around the time tombs and wary of any booby traps left behind by the Osters. There were none. The scouts found only the wreckage of Cassad's escaped mechanism and the burned-out hulks of the 2 assault boats which the Osters had lanced from orbit. There were no clues as to why they had slagged their own ships, and the Oster bodies, both in and around the boats, had been burned beyond any hope of autopsy or analysis. Cassad regained consciousness 3 Hyperion days later, swore that he remembered nothing after stealing the squid, and was shipped out on a forced torch ship 2 local weeks later. Upon returning to the web, Cassad resigned his commission. For a while he was active in anti-war movements, occasionally appearing on the All Thing net urging disarmament, but the attack on Brescia had mobilized the hegemony toward true interstellar war, as had nothing else in 3 centuries, and Cassad's voice was either drowned out or dismissed as the guilty conscious of the butcher of South Brescia. In the 16 years after Brescia, Colonel Cassad had disappeared from the web and from the web consciousness. Although there had been no more major battles, the Oster remained the hegemony's prime bogeyman. Friedman Cassad was only a fading memory. It was late morning when Cassad finished his story. The council blinked and looked around him, noticing the ship and its surroundings for the first time in more than 2 hours. The Benares had come out onto the main channel of the Hool. The council could hear the creaks of the chains and hawsers as the river mantas surged against their harnesses. The Benares appeared to be the only ship heading upriver, but now numerous small craft were visible going the other way. The council rubbed his forehead, and was surprised to see that his hand came away slick with sweat. The day had grown very warm, and the shadow of the tarp had crept away from the council without his noticing. He blinked, wiped sweat from his eyes, and moved into the shade to get a drink from one of the liquor bottles the androids had set on a cabinet near the table. "My God," Father Hoyt was saying. "So according to this Moneta creature, the time tombs are moving backward in time?" "Yes," said Cassad. "Is that possible?" asked Hoyt. "Yes. It was Sol Wintrob who answered." "If that's true," said Braun Lamia, "then you met this Moneta, or whatever her real name is, in her past but your future, in a meeting that's still to come." "Yes," said Cassad. Martin Silenus walked to the railing and spat into the river. "Connell, do you think this bitch was the Shrike?" "I don't know." Cassad's monotone was barely audible. Silenus turned to Sol Wintrob. "You're a scholar. Is there anything in the Shrike mythography that says the thing can change shape?" "No," said Wintrob. He was preparing a milk globe to feed his daughter. The infant made soft mewling noises and moved tiny fingers. "Connell," said Het Mastine, "the force field, whatever the fighting suit was, did you bring it with you after the encounter with the Osters and this female?" Cassad looked at the Templar a moment and then shook his head. The council was staring into his drink, but his head suddenly snapped upright with the force of a thought. "Connell, you said you saw a vision of the Shrike's killing tree, the structure, the thing where it impales its victims." Cassad moved his basilisk stare from the Templar to the council. He slowly nodded. "And there were bodies on it?" Another nod. The council wiped sweat from his upper lip. "If the tree is traveling backwards in time with the time tombs, then the victims are from our future." Cassad said nothing. The others also were staring at the council now, but only Wintrob appeared to understand what the comment meant, and what the council's next question had to be. The council resisted the urge to wipe the sweat from his lip again. His voice was steady. Did you see any of us there? Cassad said nothing for more than a minute. The soft sounds of the river and the ship's rigging suddenly seemed very loud. Finally, Cassad took a breath. Yes. Silence stretched again. Bron Lamia broke it. Will you tell us who? No. Cassad rose and went to the stairway leading to the lower decks. Wait, called Father Hoyt. Cassad paused at the head of the stairway. Will you at least tell us 2 other things? What? Father Hoyt grimaced from a wave of pain. His gaunt face went white under its film of perspiration. He took a breath and said, First, do you think the Shrike, the woman, somehow wants us to use you to start this terrible interstellar war you foresaw? Yes, said Cassad softly. Second, will you tell us what you plan to petition the Shrike for, or this Moneta, when you meet them on the pilgrimage? Cassad smiled for the first time. It was a thin smile, and very, very cold. I will make no petition, said Cassad. I will ask nothing of them. When I meet them this time, I will kill them. The other pilgrims did not speak, or look at one another, as Cassad went below. The Benares continued north-northeast into the afternoon. Well, a little bit of a longer one today, but I figured getting that last bit in all at once would be beneficial. Next time we will be reading chapter 3, and we will see where the story takes us from there. I hope you enjoyed your listen, and I hope you have a good week.